Hi everyone. This video documents how to replace the thermostat on a 2008 Porsche Cayenne S. I did so without removing the intake manifold, and the reason I chose to do it this way was because I felt like it was easier and less intrusive, as will be explained in a bit more detail later on in the video. The symptom indicating that the thermostat needed to be replaced involved a check engine light accompanied by a trouble code of P2181, which indicates a thermostat that is stuck in the open position. I found this procedure to be quite easy, but as with anything, there are always an infinite number of ways to screw things up, so one takes on this job at their own risk. In terms of tools, for this project, I used a metric socket set, a shallow 27mm socket for turning over the engine via the crank pulley bolt, Torx and e-torx socket sets, long needle nose pliers, a trouble light, a catch can for the coolant, and if you happen to have an unused kiddie pool handy, that would be a good idea, small and medium-sized pry bars, a U-view airlift tool, which is for refilling coolant, an air compressor, and an air regulator for use with the U-view airlift, hose clamp pliers or water pump pliers, torque wrenches, a flathead screwdriver, a 30mm box end wrench, a blowgun, a small punch, and I have a Max Jacks which I use to lift the car, but if you don't have access to a lift, then a jack and jack stands to get the car in the air, and a pipe to use as an extension for leverage when manually turning over the engine. I'm going to list parts and supplies that I used for this project, but I'm not going to explain what they were for because that will become apparent as we go through the procedure. So we will need a new thermostat, an intake socket or transfer pipe for the thermostat, and the special Porsche lubricant for that intake socket, 2 gallons of Porsche coolant as well as 2 gallons of distilled water, acetone, a new water pump and bolts if you're replacing it while you're in there, also a new dry belt if you're replacing it at the same time, a pail for mixing the coolant, a large transfer syringe, a paper cup for distilled water, chalk or painter's tape, rubber gloves, a small roughly 4-inch piece of wood, I used a 2x4, and about 2 feet of 12 gauge or similar automotive wire. To begin, with the engine cold, remove the lid on the coolant reservoir. Then safely raise the car in the air. Remove the front belly pans and remove the front right wheel and wheel well liner. This last step may not be necessary, but I found it helpful. With the wheel off, the wheel well liner out, and the belly pans off, this is the view that you have of the area where you're going to begin working. At the right front of the car, locate the lower radiator hose and the clip on the hand coupling of the lower radiator hose to the radiator and undo that clip. You simply take, as I have here, some long needle nose pliers and you pull the hand coupling clip away and press up, and that will release, once you've done that on both sides, the clamp from the coupling, and then you can proceed to separate the hose from the radiator. Before you separate the hose from the radiator, though, of course you want to have a catch can underneath, and a really suitable one, as I mentioned before, would be a kiddie pool. If you don't have one, well, it's probably going to make a pretty big mess. And that's because when you separate the hose from the radiator, coolant is going to come out of the hose and splash against here and then come back at you and everywhere else, and it's also going to come flying out of here. So and the valence of the car, because the perspective we're looking at, this is vertical, this is the front of the car, the lower valence is still on the car down here, so when it falls out, it's going to hit the lower valence and then splash every which way. So it is interesting to do this. And after detaching the hose, this is what my floor looked like. It was worse than it actually looks in this picture. There was quite a bit of coolant on the floor to clean up. Once that location has finished draining, then you can reattach the lower radiator hose and seat the clip on the hen coupling. Next, remove the two coolant hoses on the oil-water heat exchanger. Next, what I did was to attach the U-View airlift to the coolant reservoir. The purpose at this point is to use this tool to evacuate the remainder of the coolant from the system. So what I've done is to place my thumb over this line to make pressure, and also use the regulator here, which is set at 7 pounds per square inch because we don't want to put too much pressure through the system, and then open this ball valve to let the air into the system. And what that does is then blow out the remainder of the coolant through the system out where the oil water heat exchangers are still open underneath. So here you can see that I have my thumb covering over the tube from the U-View airlift, and if you look really hard you can see that there is coolant coming out from the oil water heat exchanger. So once there was no more coolant coming out from those openings, then you can reinstall the hoses to the oil water heat exchanger, reinstall the wheel well liner, reinstall the right front wheel, and don't forget, once you have the vehicle lowered after you've done the job, to torque those lug bolts to 110 foot-pounds, and then we can move on to the next step. And the next step is to remove the air intake tubes and Y pipe. And you begin by removing the engine cover that sits here. It simply pulls off these two rubber grommets just by lifting straight up. Then there are 6 plastic bolts, for lack of a better word. You can see 2 in this picture. These ones have hexes on them. I just use the needle nose pliers to gently turn them. There are tangs on the very bottom of each that line up with this channel. And once the tangs line up with the channel, then you can simply take the pliers, attach here, and pull straight up, and they'll come out, which then releases the Y pipe from the throttle body. And then on both sides there are similar pins, 2 on each side. These have a Torx fitting that you again turn it to line it up with the channel and then pull it straight out. Before doing that though, don't forget to disconnect the electrical connectors. There's 1 on each side. So once you've done that, this is the space that you have to work with. It's not too bad actually. Next, you remove the engine bay design covers from both sides, and you're left with a small pile of parts on the floor that looks like this. The next thing I did was to remove any fuses that I thought could give power to components that could fire the engine. So I opened the engine compartment fuse box and located the fuse for the high pressure fuel injector, which was fuse 11, the right fuel pump, which is fuse 13, the left fuel pump, which is fuse 14, and the electronic control unit main relay, which was fuse 15. So remove those. Next, what I did was to use some chalk to draw an arrow on the belt showing the direction of travel. Even though I was changing the belt with a brand new belt, I wanted to keep this one as a spare, and so if I ever do have to put it on, it should be replaced in the same orientation as it was when it was on before. So that's why you add the chalk line. You could also use painter's tape with a marker line, but I was a little concerned that the painter's tape would eventually stop sticking, so I thought chalk would be the better way to go. So what you do then is use a T40 socket to loosen the bolts on the water pump pulley. So that's what's happening here. And you do that at this point because you still have the belt on, and the belt naturally counter holds against the action of undoing the bolts in the pulley. The coolant connecting clip needs to be removed. So first of all, you have to take the coolant hose out of the clip, which is there. And then I took the long needle nose pliers, and there's kind of a Christmas tree type connector here going through a bracket. You just pinch on both ends to push these tangs here inward, and then push the clip out of the bracket, and it comes right out, no problem. Here's a visual of the coolant connecting clip once removed, and you can see I'm pressing on the clip with the pliers, showing you how to get it out. Before removing the dry belt, ensure that you make a diagram of the routing of the belt. So you need to know exactly how it's supposed to be routed when you reinstall it. So draw yourself a little diagram of that. Then use a 30mm box end wrench to turn the tensioner hexagon, which unfortunately you can't see in the picture, but the wrench is on it in this picture, and you turn it clockwise. So you pull in a clockwise direction, and that relieves tension on the belt so that it can be slipped off of one of the pulleys. You can take your pick of what's within reach, and then you gently allow the tensioner hexagon to go back to its resting place. Then fish out the belt from the engine compartment, and it's a surprisingly long belt. Having loosened the bolts while the belt was still attached, now you unscrew the bolts and remove the water pump pulley. Mine was kind of stuck on, and it's a plastic pulley, so you shouldn't hit it with a hammer or anything, but what I found worked for me was to put my hand the way I'm showing here, sort of cupped, and kind of wiggle that way around in various places to get it started, and then it came off quite easily after doing that. Next, I covered the throttle body with one of my nitrile gloves to keep dirt from getting in, and then I used compressed air and a blowgun to sort of blow dirt away from the water pump prior to removing it. The water pump is held on with 5 bolts. There are other bolts in the block of the same size, so you need to be careful to identify the correct bolts for removal. The 2 on the bottom are difficult to see, and bolts that are on the block could easily be mistaken for those 2 bolts. And you'll see in pictures that I'll be showing later on where the holes are in the block after the water pump is removed, as well as the holes in the uninstalled water pump. So this will become more clear in a bit. So using an E10 with a short extension, remove the 5 bolts that hold the water pump in place. My water pump then simply pulled off, but if yours is stuck, what you could do is use a dead blow hammer to gently tap on the pump to loosen it. Upon removal, a little bit of coolant came out from behind the water pump, but really not very much at all. And it's a bit difficult to remove the water pump, but it can be fished out as per the pick that you can see here. The water pump seal stayed in the block, so obviously that needs to be removed. And then we can see nicely in this picture the intake socket or transfer pipe, how it sits in front of the thermostat here, the thermostat inside, and how the intake socket makes a really good seal with the block. But this intake socket is quite stuck in place. To remove it, I looped some 12-gauge automotive wire around the first 2 winds of the spring on the thermostat. So here we can see the automotive wire wrapped around the springs of the thermostat. Note that one loop is on one side of the steel bracket holding the spring, and the other loop is on the other side of the other steel bracket holding in the spring. It's a little difficult to see in this picture, but I'll have a better picture for you of once it's removed that illustrates exactly how this was done. This was done in an attempt to ensure even pressure against the steel bracket to minimize the chances that the spring would pull past the bracket. If that were to happen, it would be very difficult to remove the thermostat and the intake pipe. So one needs to undertake this part of the job very cautiously. Once you've wound the automotive wire around the spring on both sides of the bracket, then you tie it in a knot out front to allow you to pull from that location. Next, I placed a small piece of 2x4 against the block so I wouldn't damage the block with my pry bar, and then gently pried against it to pull out the thermostat. And this worked very well. Came out. It was in there quite well, but it also came out relatively smoothly. So here's a picture of how the intake pipe and thermostat looked upon removal. And in this picture you can see more clearly how I had attached the 12 gauge automotive wire on either side of these steel brackets here. So one's on one side, the other's on the other side, which helps to ensure, as I said before, even pressure when pulling it out. So upon removal of the thermostat, some additional coolant did come out from behind the thermostat, but it was really very little. There are two holes that you can see here, where it's really one large hole, but it kind of looks like two holes in the thermostat housing that allow the coolant that was sitting behind the thermostat to fall into the valley of the engine. And I think that's the main reason why some people remove the intake when changing the thermostat on this generation of the Cayenne. And that is so that they can clean up the coolant out of the valley so that you don't smell the coolant boiling off. The problem with removing the intake is there are very brittle plastic vacuum tubes, etc., that have to be manipulated, and that can create all kinds of other problems. So that's why I did this procedure without removing the intake, was to try to avoid any of those sorts of issues. And that's also then why I use the UV airlift to push out air through the system to try to evacuate as much of the coolant as possible, because I didn't want it falling into the system here and sitting in the valley. But to further mitigate the little bit of coolant that did fall into there, I took a cup with some distilled water and just poured it into these holes. So it was maybe half a cup of water or so, just to dilute that coolant further. Another thing you can do is, if you live in a hilly areas, once you get the car reassembled and take it for a drive, just point the front end down a hill and hit the brakes pretty hard, and apparently that will also slosh out any remaining coolant that's sitting in the valley. The O-rings on the transfer pipe require a special Porsche lubricant to be applied prior to their installation, and this lubricant is diluted 50-50 with distilled water. Then it should be stirred and then applied to the O-rings. So I dumped out half of the container into another container, poured in the distilled water, and then used a straw to mix it up as shown here. Next, you install the thermostat. I didn't use any lubricant of any kind on the thermostat for installation. And ensure that the thermostat is fully seated. It needs to be in as far as it will go. And you can see in this picture how far it is into the housing. Also in this picture you can see, as I mentioned before, the bolt hole locations where the water pump goes, and you can see the bolts right below that are the same size that could be mistaken for the two bottom water pump bolts. So just bear that in mind when you're removing the water pump. Next, you apply the lubricant to the O-rings on the transfer pipe and install it into the block. The transfer pipe is correctly installed when it's perfectly flush with the block. After getting the transfer pipe started evenly, I used a small piece of 2x4, the same one that I used to pull out the old one, to gently and evenly press the transfer pipe to sit flush with the block. And here you can see the transfer pipe installed and sitting perfectly flush with the block. Next, using acetone, clean the mating surface of the block and the mating surface on the water pump itself. With the gasket installed in the water pump, my new water pump came with the gasket pre-installed in the water pump. Install the water pump and finger tighten the 5 bolts. Starting with the top bolt and working in a clockwise fashion, tighten the bolts to 7.5 foot-pounds or 90 inch-pounds. Next, install the water pump pulley to the water pump, and I used a thin punch to help me line up the holes in the pulley with the holes in the water pump. I didn't torque the bolts for the water pump pulley until after the drive belt was installed because I wanted to use the engine to counterhold the pulley just as I did when I was loosening the water pump bolts. However, the pulley would spin before I could get the correct torque on the bolts. So at this stage, if you have an appropriate method of counterholding the pulley, for example, a rubber strap wrench or something, you can torque it to 17 foot-pounds. The next thing you do is install the drive belt and begin by placing it behind the dipstick tube as shown in the picture. I placed the belt on the water pump pulley such that I could read the small text on the belt as shown here. At this point I tightened the water pump pulley bolts, and while the torque didn't quite reach 17 foot-pounds, my sense was that they were on quite tight. Then you reinstall the coolant hose connecting clip into its bracket and place the coolant hose into the clip. Check that the drive belt is correctly positioned on all pulleys and use your diagram to make sure that you have it routed correctly. And then using a shallow 27mm socket on the crankshaft bolt with a piece of pipe over the ratchet for leverage, turn the engine over, remember only in a clockwise direction, and observe that the drive belt is tracking correctly on all pulleys. Next, reinstall the fuses and the fuse cover. Then reinstall the Y-pipe for the throttle body and the air tubes. Now what you do is prepare your 50-50 mix of Porsche coolant and distilled water. My car took 10 liters of mix, and the U-View airlift system requires some extra in your container to ensure that no air is drawn into the system, so I ended up mixing about, I think, 13 liters. The instructions for the U-View airlift are straightforward, and so I won't repeat them here, but basically what you do is you attach your compressed air line and pull a vacuum on the system. Once the vacuum reaches 24 to 26, I think it's inches mercury, you close the ball valve and watch over at least 20 seconds to see if the vacuum falls. If it does fall, it means that there's a leak in the system. It's great to know that there's no leak prior to filling with the very expensive Porsche coolant. If there is a leak, obviously it needs to be identified and fixed prior to moving on to the next step of filling up the coolant. To facilitate refilling the coolant container should be about the same height as the coolant reservoir. My garbage can turned out to be the perfect height for the Cayenne. The 5-gallon pail worked very well because it easily allows submersing the line to completely fill the line so that no air enters into the system prior to attaching the line to the unit at the coolant reservoir. Once the gauge on the U-View airlift reaches 0, the system is full, so you simply remove the airlift and then check the coolant level in the reservoir. Mine looked like it might have a bit extra coolant in it, so I used a transfer syringe to remove the excess. Then what you do is you check for any visible signs of leaking. If you don't see any, then you turn the heat to high and start the car, and then check again for leaks after the car's been running for a bit. Then you let the engine cool, and once it's cold, you open the coolant reservoir and check the level again and top up as necessary. Then reinstall all the covers for the engine compartment, reinstall the front belly pans, lower the car to the ground. Don't forget to retorque that wheel to 110 foot-pounds if you did take off the front right wheel. And then take the car for a drive, paying attention to the engine temperature. And following your drive, and after the engine has completely cooled off, then check the engine coolant reservoir and top up as necessary. And then just for the drives that you take for the next few times, keep an eye on the coolant level afterward and on the coolant temperature during the drive to make sure that everything's good. So hopefully you found this helpful. I think the thermostat is something, having experienced a failure twice in 6 years, that people will fairly frequently encounter. So this is just one way of addressing it on your own. Good luck.